Despite running for 10 whole seasons and airing its final ever episode in mid-2017, 2005 marked the final time Fairly OddParents received its own game. For those of you that don't know, Fairly OddParents was initially cancelled in early 2006, while in the midst of airing its 5th season. While Nickelodeon would eventually change their minds a year later, something that wasn't revived with the show was the video game adaptations. An interesting decision because up until its premature cancellation, OddParents was getting about one video game per year. The show proved popular enough to run for another 10 years, so why didn't we ever see another video game after Clash with the Anti-World? A lot of people will end up pointing to the weird distribution issues with the show, where Nickelodeon didn't distribute OddParents in most places outside of the US, instead licensing it out to Nelvana. But I'm not so sure this is the case. Everything I've been able to find points to Nelvana holding the rights to the first 5 seasons of Fairly OddParents. This deal extended to merch outside of the US at the time, which is why you'll see PAL versions of these games removing any mention of Nick. That licensing deal is actually the entire reason there are 2 versions of this game's box art. I really prefer the PAL version, but what do you guys think? The tricky question about the Nelvana licensing deal is, would it extend in some way to the revival, which Nelvana had no hand in? Some people would confidently say yes, and point to Timmy not being in All-Star Brawl or the first 2 Nick kart races, but then you have weird cases where Timmy has appeared in video games recently. He was literally in Nickelodeon Extreme Tennis, which released earlier this year, but he also seems to be missing from Nick Kart Racers 3, so who the hell knows what the actual deal is with the rights? I'm Brandon and I'll be your captain for our voyage through Nickelodeon video game history. Firstly, I'd like to apologise to SuperSuck64 who commented on my Barnyard video telling me I'd skipped over Clash with the Anti-World. You were right and I was wrong. Clash with the Anti-World was released on October 17, 2005 exclusively for the GBA. The reason I skipped this is because some sources have this listed as a mid to late 2006 release, but that's incorrect because it doesn't line up with some of the reviews, which were posted well before this release date. Although it probably doesn't help that IGN didn't post their review of this game until 2006. No idea why they decided to circle back to a shovelware GBA title 3 months after it was released. I should just be grateful that IGN's review even still exists, because you can't find much info about this game on the internet. It doesn't even have a listing on Moby Games, which is usually my holy grail of trusted sources for obscure video games. At the helm of the final ever OddParents game was a freshman developer in Nickelodeon video game history. Razorback Developments were a British studio founded in 2003 that specialised in handheld licensed games. You might have seen their work on Bionicle, Maze of Shadows, or Xiaolin Showdown. This was their one and only Nick game, taking the reins of handheld OddParents games from Altron, who developed Enter the Cleft, and Helix, who developed the 2 ports for Breaking the Rules and Shadow Showdown. And from what little I could dig up, it seems this was one of the less impressive Fairly OddParents games. The real standout is the IGN review I mentioned, which gave the game just a 3.5 out of 10. Looks like not even having a pair of fairy godparents can save this game. First impressions can be misleading. After playing Clash with the Anti-World for about 10 minutes, I was gearing myself up to write an absolutely scathing review. The opening levels of this game really do feel like a 3 out of 10, but to my surprise, the game improves drastically, and it's actually one of the more impressive games in Nickelodeon video game history, albeit completely hamstrung by the constraints of being a licensed game. The game kicks off with Crocker up to his usual bullshit. He's created a machine that will reveal fairy godparents to everybody, but it instead makes the anti-fairies show up. They take advantage of this and somehow stop time so that it's perpetually Friday the 13th. After this, Crocker is never seen again, and honestly, the anti-fairies don't play that big of a part. Sure, the enemy fodder in levels is made up of anti-fairies, but the plot never really involves anything other than Timmy, Cosmo, and Wanda marching towards the evil lair. So after that brief narrative setup, you get dropped into the first level, and this is where the bad first impression starts. From a distance, Clash looks like a standard side-scrolling 2D platformer, and that's because it is, except the platforming is absolute rubbish. Once Timmy leaves the ground, there is no precision. Trying to guide him accurately is an absolute crapshoot. Thankfully, the devs didn't decide to make a game that entirely relies on precision platforming like a 2D Mario would. Instead, there's more focus around combat and some unique traversal abilities that don't rely on you being pixel perfect. But a big part of this game is focused on you jumping on the heads of enemies, and the platforming is so bad that even performing this basic platformer task is a chore. Landing on these slow-moving enemies should not be nearly as hard as it is here. I'm not some elite gamer or anything, but I'm competent enough to land on a Goomba's head 9 times out of 10. In Clash with the Anti-World, it genuinely felt like it was my first go at using a controller half the time. Adding to the really poor first impression is the explanation Cosmo and Wanda give for the combat. They tell you that jumping on an anti-fairy will take them down, but only temporarily. But when you do this, it seems like you just straight up kill them. Unlike most games that have enemies that just get stunned, the anti-fairies poof out of existence. It's true that many of these enemies would eventually respawn after a very generous time frame, but there were other enemies that I swear never came back. It made the start of the game seriously confusing as I was trying to work out whether Cosmo and Wanda were messing with me or not. But whatever, jumping on anti-fairies defeats them, cool. When you do this, they'll drop wands, which are actually Timmy Turner's version of Sonic's rings. Get touched with 0 wands, you're dead. Get touched with a bunch of wands, you'll spill some of them, but have the opportunity to recollect them. Speaking of death, I have no idea what the point of the life system in this game is. Generally in a platformer, losing a life will push you back to a checkpoint, and losing all of your lives will force you to restart the level from the beginning, push you back to the beginning of a world, or it will straight up give you a game over. In Clash with the Anti-World, there are no checkpoints, so every death puts you back at the beginning of the level. And then when you lose all of your lives, it puts you back at the beginning of the level. Why not just cut out the middleman and ditch the lives entirely? They're pointless. And don't get me started on the fact that you spawn with 0 wands. In some levels, this is okay because you almost immediately have an easy way to farm a wand or 2, but in others, particularly this god-awful Fairy World one, it's just torture. But as I alluded to at the start of this review, the game does get better, and a lot of that is to do with Timmy actually being able to use wishes to some degree here. Fairly OddParents is a show that is both perfect for video games and an absolute nightmare. On one hand, Timmy can wish for pretty much anything, so you have so much room for creativity. On the other hand, Timmy can wish for pretty much anything, which could make the game's central conflict resolvable in about 5 seconds. Most of the other Fairly OddParents games get around this by having Cosmo and Wanda get nerfed immediately, having their abilities be drained or something like that. Clash doesn't do that, and while we don't have some Scribblenauts-esque system where you can wish for a billion different things, the way they do use the wishes is better than most of the previous games in my opinion. In 4 of the game's worlds, Timmy will make a wish to give himself a power that will work particularly well in that world. First up is the Super Gardener, the least interesting of the abilities. This consists of a leaf blower that is only ever used to kill these plant enemies that never show up again after the first world, and to put these seeds in holes, which also never show up again. You can also water plants that grow into platforms that, you guessed it, never show up again. Thankfully, the next power is the pirate one, and that is so much fun. This gives you a hook attack that flies out and can kill enemies in a variety of directions, which is an actual game changer. It's so overpowered, so the devs tied this one to your wand power. Every time you use the hook attack, you drain a bit of your wand meter. Its traversal effect allows you to slide along these ropes that do make a return outside of their introductory world. Then there's Timmy turning into a car, which I can't say I had much use for outside of its specific levels, but I'll touch on those in a little bit. And finally, there's the ninja power. This will turn you invisible and therefore invincible if you stand still, and you're also able to wall jump on specific walls. The attack is a lot like the pirate hook attack, but simply goes in a straight line. However, this attack is unlimited, making it so overpowered. Once you get the ninja power, you won't bother to equip anything else, as it'll just melt through every enemy and steamroll you towards the end of the game. To round things out, you've got platformer staples like invincibility power-ups and discoverable bonus worlds. And there's also this neat little mechanic where Timmy sort of pulls himself up onto a ledge if you're close enough, which really made me feel like the devs knew their platforming was terrible and they had to try and add in fallbacks like this to make it a little bearable. Where the game truly shines is how it combines Timmy's powers with the level design. The first world of this game is a complete wash. The gardening powers suck, and the levels are just boring. I mean, you're using a leaf blower for God's sake. Also, they completely overlooked the fact that you can get stuck here. In the section where you need to blow these seeds into holes, if you walk past the foot of the stairs without blowing over the seed, you cannot get back. Maybe there is some secret maneuver to get back, but I couldn't figure it out. Once you walked past the point of no return, there was no going back. The pirate world is where things really kick off. Sliding along these ropes and taking out enemies from all angles with the hook is ridiculously fun, especially so when compared to the dreck you were slogging through 2 minutes earlier. The car world that follows is just about the most unique part of the game. While the power comes across as basically useless for the rest of the game, here it's a neat take on platforming. Having the boss battle for this world be a race was also a happy surprise. It felt like I was doing one of those boss races from Crash Team Racing, rather than your stock standard 2D platformer boss battle where you just bounce on their head 3 times. And then there's the ninja world, which uses the wall jumping perfectly to create this wild and windy level that somehow isn't impacted by the game's usually awful platforming. I think the fact that Timmy clings to the walls here negates a lot of the awkward in-air movement, and it makes me wish this whole game was set up like this. But then the final world of the game is a huge letdown. You're finally able to use all of Timmy's powers, but the devs don't do anything with it. They don't force you to switch on the fly to get past certain obstacles and string all the powers together. Instead, it's more in line with the first couple of dull levels. The final level is arguably the worst of the whole game. It pretty much consists of scrolling through these 2 same looking screens over and over again as the game spams more and more enemies at you. It's clear the devs were going for a ramp up in difficulty as you progress through the stage, but I think they forgot that the ninja power existed and it just carves through everything. Although they kind of salvage it with the final boss battle. It's not good per se, but it gets points for being creative. Timmy catches up with Auntie Timmy, who is technically the game's final boss, but he's a massive dweeb, so Timmy turns into a gigantic gerbil and he chases him down while slaughtering hundreds of anti-fairies. Again, it isn't really good, but I've played so many generic shovelware 2D platformers at this point that you just expect the climax of the game to be a basic ass boss battle.
Receiving incoming transmission.
Target lost.
Fairly OddParents Clash with the Anti-World is one of the rare video game examples where a first impression isn't exactly representative of the entire game. I feel like, at least in my personal experience, if a game gets off on the wrong foot with you, it's only downhill from there. It's not usually possible for a dev to salvage it. But Clash does just that. The opening world feels every bit of the 3.5 out of 10 review score, but from the second world onward it gets much better, and it does some really interesting things with its mechanics and level design. Stuff like the car race boss battle and the climax to the entire game are pretty creative, and show that Razorback were looking to go beyond the typical low-effort licensed game. But I get the feeling that they were the victim of a very strict development cycle. Clash with the Anti-World is only about 90 minutes long. With the way it speeds through everything, you'd be forgiven for thinking your game had been corrupted and somehow skipped over half the levels. Razorback brings enough creative and enjoyable ideas to the table that I would have loved to see how this game would have turned out if they were given the time to fully flesh it out. This all leads me to this weird feeling where Clash with the Anti-World isn't exactly good, but it's not as bad as the only surviving reviews might make it out to be. Would I recommend you go out and play it? Yeah, I would. It's only 90 minutes of your life, and there are enough nuggets of gold that you're likely to really enjoy. Next time, we'll be taking a look at another Butch Hartman game with Danny Phantom Urban Jungle. This was the second and final Danny Phantom game to be made, and just the third Nickelodeon Nintendo DS game. The first Danny Phantom game was a complete letdown, despite the IP being perfect for a video game version. I'm holding out hope that Urban Jungle won't let me down. To make sure you don't miss that video or any of my upcoming reviews, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And to stay up to date with everything that's happening with the channel, jump over to Twitter and give me a follow.